The Herity Oak Guardian, Part 1. The anonymous threat. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Its bold red ink bleeding through the envelope like a wound. Barbara Chun, president of the Heritage Oak Homeowners Association, held the threatening message with steady hands, despite the chill that ran down her spine. The words were clear and menacing. "Stop interfering with our plans, or face the consequences. You have been warned." Barbara adjusted her red blazer and placed her signature red-rimmed glasses more firmly on her nose as she reread the letter in her home office. After serving as HOA president for 3 years, she had received her share of complaints and criticism, but nothing quite like this. The community of Heritage Oak had always been her pride and joy, a carefully maintained neighborhood of 215 homes where families felt safe and property values remained stable. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Margaret Wells, the 72-year-old treasurer and Barbara's closest ally on the board. "Barbara, dear, I hope you're sitting down." Margaret's voice trembled through the receiver. "I found something disturbing in our financial records. Someone has been accessing our accounts without authorization." Barbara's heart skipped a beat. The HOA managed over $600,000 in annual dues and reserves, money that funded everything from landscaping to emergency repairs. Any breach of their financial security could devastate the entire community. "I'll be right over," Barbara said, grabbing her keys and the anonymous letter. 20 minutes later, she sat in Margaret's immaculate living room, both women poring over bank statements and access logs on Margaret's laptop. "Look here." Margaret pointed to a series of login attempts. "Someone tried to access our main account 15 times last week, all from an IP address I don't recognize. They didn't succeed. Thank goodness for two-factor authentication. But the attempt stops exactly 3 days ago." Barbara studied the dates carefully. The login attempts had ceased the same day she had announced her intention to investigate the questionable landscaping contracts that had been draining their budget. For months, she had noticed irregularities in the billing from Greenscape Solutions, the company that had taken over their maintenance in January 2024. "Margaret, I think someone is trying to stop us from looking into those landscaping contracts," Barbara said, showing her friend the anonymous letter. "This arrived this morning." Margaret's face went pale as she read the threatening words. "Barbara, this is serious. We need to call the police." "Not yet," Barbara replied, her mind already forming a plan. "First, let's gather more evidence. If someone is embezzling from our community, I want to make sure we have an airtight case." That afternoon, Barbara drove through Heritage Oak's winding streets, observing the work being done by Greenscape Solutions. She had always prided herself on knowing every detail about their community, from the specific shade of beige required for exterior paint to the exact specifications for fence height. Now, she was using that knowledge for detective work. At Maple Drive, she noticed something odd. The crew was using low-grade fertilizer despite the HOA paying premium prices for organic treatments. At Oak Ridge Circle, the workers were planting cheap shrubs that looked suspiciously different from the expensive native plants listed on their invoice. Barbara parked near the community center and called David Rodriguez, the newest board member who worked in construction. "David, I need your expertise. Can you meet me at the main entrance in 15 minutes? I want your opinion on some landscaping work." David arrived promptly, his work boots still dusty from his day job as a foreman. Barbara had recruited him to the board specifically because of his experience with contractors and his reputation for honesty. "Barbara, what's this about?" David asked, noting the serious expression on her face. "I need you to look at the work Greenscape has been doing and tell me if it matches what we're paying for," she said, handing him copies of their recent invoices. "And David, this stays between us for now." They spent the next hour walking through the neighborhood, David examining the landscaping with a professional eye. His expression grew increasingly grim as they progressed. "Barbara, this is bad," David said finally, stopping near the playground where a crew was supposedly installing a premium irrigation system. "They charged us $12,000 for high-end drip irrigation, but what they've installed is basic sprinkler heads worth maybe $3,000. The mulch they've been using costs about half what they're charging us for." Barbara felt her anger rising, but she kept her voice steady. "How much money are we talking about, David? Based on what I've seen today, I'd estimate they've overcharged the HOA by at least $40,000 since they started the contract. Maybe more. $40,000. Barbara's mind reeled at the figure. That was money that could have funded playground improvements, additional security cameras, or been returned to homeowners through reduced fees. Instead, it had been stolen through fraudulent billing. "David, I need you to document everything you've found," Barbara said. "Take photos. Make notes about the discrepancies. We're going to expose this fraud." That evening, Barbara sat in her kitchen, surrounded by financial documents and David's preliminary report. Her husband, James, watched with concern as she worked late into the night. "Honey, maybe you should let someone else handle this," James suggested gently. "That threatening letter has me worried." Barbara looked up from her laptop, her determination evident in her eyes. "James, I took an oath when I became president to protect our community and its resources. 215 families trust me to do the right thing. I can't let them down." "I know, and I'm proud of you," James replied. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "This obviously involves more money than some simple overcharging." Barbara nodded, but her attention was already back on the documents. She had noticed something else troubling in the Greenscape contracts. The company had been awarded the job without the standard bidding process that HOA bylaws required for contracts, over $10,000. The decision had been made during an emergency board meeting in December 2023, when Barbara had been out of town for her father's surgery. The meeting minutes showed that only 3 board members had been present: former Vice President Richard Walsh, Secretary Linda Morrison, and board member Tom Stevens. Barbara remembered being frustrated at the time that such an important decision had been made in her absence, but she had trusted her fellow board members' judgment. Now, she was beginning to wonder if that trust had been misplaced. Richard Walsh had resigned from the board abruptly in February, citing personal reasons and moving to another state. Linda Morrison had become increasingly distant and defensive during recent board meetings. Tom Stevens had been pushing for expanded contracts with Greenscape, despite Barbara's concerns about their performance. Barbara reached for her phone and dialed Margaret's number. Despite the late hour, her friend answered on the first ring. "Margaret, I need you to pull all the records from the December emergency meeting," Barbara said. "Something doesn't add up about how Greenscape got this contract." "Barbara, it's almost 11 o'clock, Margaret protested. "Can't this wait until morning?" "I'm afraid it can't. I think the corruption goes deeper than just overcharging for landscaping. I think some of our own board members might be involved." There was silence on the other end of the line before Margaret spoke again. Her voice hushed. "Barbara, I've been thinking the same thing. Linda has been asking a lot of questions about our financial reviews lately, and Tom tried to convince me to delay the annual audit by 6 months." Barbara felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Margaret, we need to be very careful about who we trust." "Can you access the files remotely?" "Yes, I have everything backed up on my personal cloud storage as a precaution. I learned that habit from my late husband's business practices." "Good. Don't access them from the HOA office. If someone has been trying to hack our accounts, they might be monitoring our computer usage there too." The next morning, Barbara woke to find another letter slipped under her front door. This one was even more explicit in its threats. "We know you were asking questions yesterday. Stop now, or your family will pay the price. This is your final warning." Barbara's hands trembled as she read the message, but her resolve only strengthened. The fact that someone knew about her investigation so quickly confirmed her suspicion that the corruption included people with inside access to HOA operations. She photographed the letter and immediately called Detective Sarah Martinez at the local police station. Detective Martinez had handled several fraud cases in their area and had a reputation for Senora Chun. "Based on what you've told me, this sounds like a complex embezzlement scheme," Detective Martinez said during their phone conversation. "The threatening letters escalate this to potential intimidation charges. I'd like to meet with you this afternoon to review your evidence." Barbara agreed to the meeting, feeling relief. that law enforcement was now involved. However, she knew she still had work to do. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and she needed to be prepared to present her findings without alerting any potentially corrupt board members to the ongoing investigation. That afternoon, Barbara met with Detective Martinez at a coffee shop outside the Heritage Oak community. The detective was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who took detailed notes as Barbara presented her evidence. "Señora Chun, this is excellent work," Detective Martinez said, reviewing David's documentation of the landscaping discrepancies. "However, I need you to be very careful. If some of your board members are involved, they might try to destroy evidence or transfer money out of HOA accounts if they suspect they're under investigation." "What do you suggest?" Barbara asked. "Continue gathering evidence, but don't confront anyone directly yet. We need to build a comprehensive case before making any moves. Can you get me access to all the financial records and contracts?" Barbara nodded. "Margaret has everything backed up. She's completely trustworthy. Good. I also want to arrange for additional patrols in your neighborhood. Those threatening letters concern me, especially since they mentioned your family." As Barbara drove home from the meeting, she felt both anxious and determined. She had spent 3 years building Heritage Oak into a model community, carefully balancing fiscal responsibility with resident needs. The thought that someone had been stealing from her neighbors and threatening her family filled her with righteous anger. That evening, she called an emergency meeting with David and Margaret at her home. They needed to coordinate their strategy for the board meeting while being careful not to tip off any potential conspirators. "I've been thinking about the timeline," Barbara said as the three sat around her dining room table. Richard Walsh was pushing hard for the greenscape contract before he suddenly resigned. Linda Morrison has been defensive about financial reviews. Tom Stevens keeps advocating for expanded contracts with Greenscape despite obvious problems. David nodded grimly. "I ran into Tom at the hardware store yesterday. He asked a lot of questions about what we discussed during our neighborhood walk. I kept it vague, but he seemed nervous." "We need to be very careful tomorrow night," Margaret warned. "If any of them are involved, they'll be watching for signs that we're investigating." Barbara looked at her two trusted allies, feeling grateful for their support and commitment to the community. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to propose a comprehensive audit of all vendor contracts from the past 18 months. I'll present it as a routine review for cost savings, not as a fraud investigation." "That's smart," David agreed. "If someone objects too strongly to a routine audit, it will be suspicious." As her friends prepared to leave, Barbara's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she read the words, "We're watching you right now. Cancel tomorrow's meeting, or face the consequences." Barbara showed the message to David and Margaret, who both looked alarmed. "They're escalating," Margaret whispered. "Good," Barbara said firmly, surprising her friends with a resolute tone. "That means we're getting close to exposing them. The more desperate they become, the more likely they are to make mistakes." David looked out the window nervously. "Barbara, what if they're serious about the threats?" Barbara straightened her shoulders, her red blazer catching the light from her dining room chandelier. "Then we make sure we have backup." Detective Martinez said she'd arrange for extra patrols. "I'm also going to ask James to attend the meeting tomorrow night." "What about the other residents?" Margaret asked. "They deserve to know if their money is being stolen." "Soon," Barbara promised. "Once we have enough evidence to make arrests, we'll call a community meeting and explain everything. But right now, we need to keep this investigation quiet to protect the integrity of our case." As David and Margaret left, Barbara locked the door behind them and checked all the windows. The anonymous threats were clearly meant to intimidate her into abandoning her investigation, but they had achieved the opposite effect. Barbara Chun had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. She spent the rest of the evening preparing her presentation for the board meeting, carefully crafting her proposal for the contract audit in language that would seem routine to innocent board members but would trap any conspirators into revealing themselves through their objections. Barbara had built her reputation as HOA president on transparency, fiscal responsibility, and protection of community resources. Tomorrow night, those principles would be put to their ultimate test. Someone in Heritage Oak was stealing from her neighbors and threatening her family, but they had made a critical mistake in choosing Barbara Chun as their target. She was about to show them exactly what happened when you threatened the Heritage Oak community on her watch. The corruption investigation had revealed not just financial fraud, but a network of deception that threatened the very foundation of trust that held their neighborhood together. Barbara knew that exposing the truth would require courage, strategy, and unwavering commitment to justice. What do you think will happen at tomorrow night's board meeting? Will Barbara be able to expose the corruption without putting herself in danger? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for Part 2, where the tension reaches its breaking point. Part 2, coming soon. The Heritage Oak Guardian Part 2. The board meeting showdown. The Heritage Oak Community Center buzzed with unusual tension on Thursday evening, March 27th. Barbara Chun arrived 30 minutes early, her red blazer impeccably pressed, and her red-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent lights. As she arranged her presentation materials, tonight's board meeting would determine the fate of her investigation into the Greenscape Solutions fraud, and she knew that at least one person in the room was working against the community's interests. Margaret Wells sat in her usual spot near the front, her laptop open and ready to take detailed minutes. David Rodriguez positioned himself strategically near the back exit, his construction workers' instincts alert for any signs of trouble. James Chun, Barbara's husband, occupied a seat in the middle of the room, his presence both comforting and protective. As residents began filing in for the 7 o'clock meeting, Barbara noticed several unusual attendees. Mrs. Patricia Hamilton from Elm Street, who had never attended a board meeting in her 8 years of residence, sat near the door with a nervous expression. Mr. Robert Kim from Oak Ridge Circle kept checking his phone and glancing toward the exit. Most concerning was the presence of 3 men Barbara didn't recognize, all wearing similar dark suits and maintaining careful observation of the room. Tom Stevens arrived exactly at 7. His usually jovial demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. He avoided eye contact with Barbara and took his seat at the board table with unusual haste. Linda Morrison entered moments later, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she organized her papers. "Good evening, everyone," Barbara began, calling the meeting to order with her characteristic confidence. "Thank you all for attending tonight's regularly scheduled board meeting. We have several important items on our agenda, including a proposal for a comprehensive contract audit that I believe will benefit our entire community." She noticed Tom Stevens' jaw tighten at the word audit, and Linda Morrison's nervous fidgeting increased. The 3 unidentified men in dark suits shifted in their seats, their attention focused intently on Barbara's every word. After dispensing with routine business including approval of the previous month's minutes and the treasurer's report, Barbara stood to present her carefully prepared proposal. "Board members and residents, I've been conducting a preliminary review of our vendor contracts over the past 18 months. My analysis suggests we may be able to achieve significant cost savings through improved oversight and competitive bidding processes." Margaret nodded approvingly and began typing notes on her laptop. David leaned forward in his seat, ready to provide technical support for Barbara's presentation. Several residents murmured with interest at the prospect of reduced HOA fees. "Specifically, I'm proposing that we conduct a thorough audit of our landscaping contracts with Greenscape Solutions," Barbara continued, watching carefully for reactions. "This audit would examine billing accuracy, work quality verification, and compliance with our agreed-upon specifications." Tom Stevens immediately interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that surprised several residents. "Barbara, I don't think that's necessary. Greenscape has been doing excellent work, and an audit would be a waste of time and money." "With respect," Tom Barber replied calmly, "routine audits are standard practice for any organization managing significant financial resources. We're responsible for over $600,000 in annual dues and reserves. Our residents deserve transparency and accountability." Linda Morrison spoke up, her voice shaky. "I agree with Tom. We shouldn't waste money on unnecessary audits when that money could be used for community improvements. Barbara had anticipated this resistance, but the vehemence of their objections confirmed her suspicions about their involvement in the fraud. Actually, Linda, a professional audit would cost approximately $3,000, which represents less than half of 1% of our annual budget. If the audit identifies even minor billing discrepancies, it would pay for itself many times over. David Rodriguez stood up from his seat in the back. If I may address the board, I'd like to support Barbara's proposal. As someone who works in construction, I can tell you that regular audits protect both contractors and clients by ensuring everyone is operating transparently. One of the unidentified men in dark suits whispered something to his companion, and Barbara noticed them both reaching for their phones. Her instincts told her that these weren't innocent residents attending their first board meeting. Furthermore, Barbara continued, her voice growing stronger, I've prepared a preliminary analysis that suggests we may have been overcharged for certain services. David has provided technical expertise, confirming that some installations don't match the premium specifications we've been paying for. Tom Stevens' face flushed red. That's a serious accusation, Barbara. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims. I do, Barbara replied, opening her presentation folder. I have photographic documentation of substandard materials being used despite premium billing, invoices that don't match actual work performed, and billing irregularities that warrant immediate investigation. The room fell silent as Barbara began displaying photographs on her laptop screen connected to the community center's projector. The images clearly showed cheap sprinkler heads installed in locations where the HOA had paid for premium drip irrigation systems. Additional photos documented low-grade fertilizer bags, despite invoices billing for organic treatments. Gasps arose from several residents as they realized the implications of what they were seeing. Mrs. Hamilton raised her hand tentatively. Barbara, are you saying someone has been stealing from our HOA? I'm saying that we have documented evidence of billing discrepancies that require professional investigation, Barbara replied carefully, aware that Detective Martinez had advised her not to make direct accusations without complete proof. The audit I'm proposing would determine the exact nature and scope of these irregularities. Linda Morrison abruptly stood up, knocking over her water bottle in the process. This is ridiculous. Barbara, you're creating drama where none exists. I motion to table this proposal indefinitely. I second that motion, Tom Stevens said quickly. Too quickly for anyone who wasn't desperately trying to shut down the discussion. Barbara remained calm, despite the obvious attempt to derail her investigation. I appreciate your concerns, but we have a fiduciary duty to our residents. David, as the newest board member, what's your opinion on proceeding with the audit? David stood again, his voice steady and professional. Based on the evidence I've seen, I strongly support a full audit. In fact, I believe we should expand it to include all vendor contracts from the past 2 years. Margaret Wells looked up from her laptop. I also support the audit proposal. As treasurer, I have a responsibility to ensure our financial records are accurate and complete. The vote was 3 in favor and 2 opposed. With Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison providing the only opposition, Barbara felt a surge of satisfaction as she recorded the results, but she also noticed one of the unidentified men quietly exit the room while speaking into his phone. The audit proposal is approved, Barbara announced. Margaret, please contact Peterson and Associates to schedule the engagement. I want this audit to begin within 2 weeks. As the formal meeting concluded and residents began filing out, Tom Stevens approached Barbara with barely controlled anger. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, he said in a low voice. Some things are better left alone. Barbara met his gaze steadily. Tom, are you threatening me? Because if you are, I should mention that Detective Martinez, with the police department, is already aware of our concerns about financial irregularities. Tom's face went pale at the mention of police involvement. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just saying that sometimes investigations can uncover things people weren't expecting. Linda Morrison hurried past them toward the exit, avoiding eye contact with Barbara entirely. Her rushed departure and obvious distress confirmed Barbara's suspicions about her involvement in the fraud scheme. After most residents had left, Barbara, Margaret, and David gathered near the front of the room to discuss next steps. James Chun joined them. His expression concerned. "Barbara, those 3 men in suits weren't residents," James said quietly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never seen any of them before. They were asking questions about you and taking photos of your car in the parking lot." David nodded grimly. "I noticed them, too. They had the look of private investigators or security personnel. Someone called them here tonight." Margaret closed her laptop with a worried expression. "Baba, this is escalating beyond financial fraud. If they're bringing in outside people to intimidate you, we might be dealing with organized criminal activity." Barbara adjusted her red blazer and straightened her glasses, her determination evident despite the mounting pressure. "Then we need to move faster. Margaret, I want you to make copies of all financial records tonight and store them somewhere safe. David, can you document everything you observed about the greenscape work this week?" "Already done," David replied. "I have photos, measurements, and material samples. I also contacted my supplier to verify the actual cost of materials Greenscape claimed to use. The price differences are staggering." As they prepared to leave the community center, Barbara's phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Martinez's number. "Mrs. Chun, we've been monitoring the situation tonight," Detective Martinez said without preamble. "Our patrol units observed several suspicious vehicles in your neighborhood during the board meeting. I think it's time to accelerate our investigation." "What do you need from us?" Barbara asked, feeling both relieved and apprehensive about increased police involvement. "I need all your financial evidence and documentation delivered to the station tomorrow morning. We're also going to place your family under protective surveillance until we can make arrests." Barbara felt a chill run down her spine. "Detective, exactly how serious is this situation?" "Serious enough that we've identified connections between your green fraud and a larger money laundering operation that spans multiple HOAs in the region. You've stumbled onto something much bigger than simple embezzlement." The revelation hit Barbara like a physical blow. What had started as concerns about overcharging for landscaping services had evolved into a complex criminal conspiracy involving multiple communities and potentially millions of dollars. As they walked to the parking lot, James took Barbara's arm protectively. "Honey, maybe it's time to step back and let the police handle this." Barbara paused next to her car, looking back at the Heritage Community Center, where she had just successfully pushed through the audit proposal, despite intimidation and opposition. "James, 215 families trusted me to protect their interests when they elected me president. I can't abandon that responsibility just because it's become dangerous." Margaret reached out and squeezed Barbara's hand. "We're with you, dear. Whatever this investigation uncovers, we'll see it through together." David nodded in agreement. "Barbara, you've shown incredible courage tonight. Tom and Linda's reactions prove they're involved in this fraud. Now we just need to gather enough evidence to put them away." As they prepared to leave, Barbara noticed a dark sedan with tinted windows parked across the street. The vehicle hadn't been there when the meeting started, and its occupants appeared to be watching their group. "Everyone get in your cars and drive straight home," Barbara instructed quietly. "Don't stop anywhere, and call me when you arrive safely." The drive home felt longer than usual, with Barbara constantly checking her rear-view mirror for signs of being followed. The dark sedan maintained a discreet distance behind her, confirming her suspicions that the criminal organization was now taking her investigation very seriously. Once safely inside her house, Barbara immediately called Detective Martinez to report the surveillance. The detective's response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Chun, we're moving the timeline up. I need you and your husband to come to the station first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to put you in protective custody while we execute search warrants for Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison." Barbara felt a mixture of fear and vindication. Her investigation had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that threatened not just Heritage Oak, but potentially dozens of other communities. The fraud she had discovered was part of a much larger operation designed to systematically steal from homeowners associations throughout the region. That night, Barbara lay awake, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. What had started with anonymous threatening letters and suspicious landscaping bills had evolved into a complex investigation involving police protection and criminal conspiracies. But throughout it all, her commitment to protecting her community had never wavered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and potentially dangerous confrontations, but Barbara Chun was ready. She had spent 3 years building HOA into a model community, and she wasn't about to let criminals destroy everything she and her neighbors had worked to create. The board meeting had been a complete success, with the audit proposal approved despite fierce opposition from the conspirators. Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison had revealed their guilt through their desperate attempts to block the investigation, while the presence of unknown surveillance personnel confirmed that the fraud extended far beyond simple overcharging for landscaping services. Barbara's methodical approach to gathering evidence had created an ironclad case that would soon lead to criminal charges. As she reflected on the evening's events, Barbara realized that her 3 years of experience as HOA president had prepared her perfectly for this moment. Her attention to detail, commitment to transparency, and refusal to back down from challenges had enabled her to uncover a sophisticated criminal operation that might have continued stealing from communities for years without detection. The investigation had evolved from simple concerns about billing irregularities to a complex case involving organized crime, money laundering, and systematic fraud targeting homeowners associations throughout the region. Barbara's courage in pursuing the truth, despite threats and intimidation, had not only protected HOA's financial resources, but it also exposed a criminal network that was victimizing countless other communities. Tomorrow's meeting with Detective Martinez would mark the beginning of the final phase of the investigation. Barbara had gathered comprehensive evidence documenting the fraud, identified the key conspirators within her own board, and provided law enforcement with the information needed to execute search warrants and make arrests. Her unwavering commitment to protecting her community had transformed her from an HOA president into a citizen crime fighter who refused to let criminals prey on her neighbors. The Heritage Oak Community Center stood empty now, its lights dimmed after hosting one of the most important board meetings in the neighborhood's history. Barbara's presentation had not only exposed financial fraud, but it also demonstrated the power of determined leadership and community vigilance. Her red blazer and red-rimmed glasses had become symbols of unwavering integrity and fearless advocacy for the residents who had placed their trust in her leadership. Now it was time for the next phase of the investigation, where Barbara's evidence would help law enforcement dismantle a criminal organization that had been systematically stealing from homeowners throughout the region. The woman who had started this journey by questioning suspicious landscaping bills was about to help bring down a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that threatened the financial security of thousands of families. Will Barbara's evidence be enough to expose the full scope of the criminal conspiracy? What will happen when police execute the search warrants for Tom and Linda? Share your predictions in the comments below, and don't miss Part 3, where the investigation reaches its explosive climax. Part 3, coming soon. The HOA Guardian Part 3. Justice prevails. The sun had barely risen over HOA on Friday morning, March 28, 2020, when Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the Chun residence with 2 unmarked police vehicles. Barbara Chun, dressed in her signature red blazer despite the early hour, had been awake since 5 o'clock, reviewing her evidence files one final time before turning them over to law enforcement. Senora Chun, I want you to know that your investigation has uncovered one of the largest HOA fraud schemes we've ever encountered, Detective Martinez said as she sat in Barbara's living room, carefully cataloging each piece of evidence. The financial records you and Margaret Wells compiled, combined with David Rodriguez's technical documentation, have given us everything we need to dismantle this criminal organization. Barbara adjusted her red-rimmed glasses as she handed over the final folder of documentation. Detective, how many communities have been affected by this fraud? Based on our investigation, at least 18 homeowners associations across 3 counties have been victimized. Detective Martinez replied grimly. The total amount stolen exceeds $2.7 million. Your Heritage Oak community lost approximately $85,000, but some larger HOAs were defrauded of over $300,000 each. The magnitude of the criminal enterprise stunned Barbara. What had started as her concern about questionable landscaping bills had exposed a sophisticated network designed to systematically steal from homeowners associations throughout the region. Her persistence and attention to detail had potentially saved dozens of communities from continued financial exploitation. "We're executing search warrants this morning for Tom Stevens, Linda Morrison, and Richard Walsh," Detective Martinez continued. "Walsh may have relocated to another state, but we've been working with federal authorities to track his current location. The evidence suggests he was the mastermind who recruited inside accomplices at various James Chun brought coffee for Detective Martinez, while Barbara finalized her statement. "Sarah, will Barbara need to testify in court?" "Absolutely. Mrs. Chun's testimony will be crucial for establishing the timeline of the fraud and demonstrating how the conspirators attempted to intimidate witnesses. Her courage in pursuing this investigation despite threats will be a key element in our prosecution strategy." At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, police teams simultaneously executed search warrants at the homes of Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison. Barbara watched from her front window as unmarked cars positioned themselves strategically throughout Heritage Oak, coordinating the operation through encrypted radio communications. Detective Martinez's radio crackled with updates from the field teams. "Unit 2 to command. We have Stevens E. in custody. Suspect was attempting to destroy documents when we entered. We've recovered computers, financial records, and what appears to be correspondence with Greenscape Solutions." Minutes later, another transmission confirmed Linda Morrison's arrest. "Unit 3 to command. Morrison is in custody. We found a safe containing over $40,000 in cash, along with bank records showing deposits that match missing HOA funds." Barbara felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. These were people she had worked with for months, individuals she had trusted to help manage their community's affairs. Their betrayal of that trust had not only stolen money, but had violated the fundamental bonds that held neighborhoods together. By 10 o'clock, Margaret Wells and David Rodriguez had arrived at the Chun home to coordinate with Detective Martinez about the ongoing investigation. Margaret brought her laptop containing backup copies of all HOA financial records, while David carried additional photographic evidence he had gathered over the past week. "Barbara, the community is going to want answers," Margaret said, her voice reflecting both relief and concern. "Word is already spreading about the arrests. People are asking questions about how much money was stolen and whether their dues will need to increase to cover the losses." Barbara had anticipated this concern and had already begun planning her response. "Margaret, I want to call an emergency community meeting for Sunday afternoon. We'll provide a complete accounting of the fraud, explain the steps we're taking to recover stolen funds, and outline our plans for preventing future financial crimes." Detective Martinez looked up from her notes. "Mrs. Chun, I should mention that federal authorities are also interested in your case. The money laundering aspects of this scheme cross state lines, which brings it under federal jurisdiction. Your evidence may be instrumental in a much larger prosecution." The scope of the criminal enterprise continued to expand with each new revelation. Barbara's investigation had not only protected Heritage Oak, but it also provided law enforcement with the evidence needed to dismantle a multi-state fraud operation that had been victimizing homeowners associations for over 2 years. At noon, Detective Martinez received a call that brought the investigation to its dramatic conclusion. Richard Walsh, the former Heritage Oak board member who had initially recruited Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison into the fraud scheme, had been arrested at his new residence in Phoenix, Arizona. Federal agents had recovered detailed records documenting the entire criminal operation, including lists of targeted HOAs and financial projections for future fraud. Señora Walsh's records show that Heritage Oak was specifically targeted because of its substantial reserves and historically minimal oversight of vendor contracts. Detective Martinez explained, "Your decision to investigate the Greenscape billing irregularities disrupted their timeline and ultimately exposed the entire operation." Barbara felt a mixture of anger and determination as she processed this information. The criminals had viewed her community as an easy target, assuming that busy homeowners would not scrutinize financial details closely enough to detect sophisticated fraud. They had underestimated both Barbara's commitment to transparency and her willingness to pursue justice despite intimidation and threats. Sunday afternoon's community meeting drew the largest attendance in Heritage Oak's history. Over 150 residents packed the community center, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern, curiosity, and admiration for Barbara's leadership during the crisis. Local media representatives had also arrived, having learned about the arrests and the scope of the fraud investigation. Barbara stood at the front of the room, her red blazer and red-rimmed glasses now symbols of integrity and fearless advocacy for community interests. She had prepared a comprehensive presentation detailing the timeline of her investigation, the evidence that had been uncovered, and the steps being taken to recover stolen funds. Fellow residents of Heritage Oak, Barbara began, her voice strong and confident despite the emotional weight of the revelations she was about to share. Over the past 2 weeks, we have uncovered evidence of systematic fraud that resulted in the theft of approximately $85,000 from our community's funds. Gasps and murmurs arose from the audience as residents realized the magnitude of the theft. Barbara continued with her presentation, methodically explaining how the fraud had been discovered, who had been involved, and what steps had been taken to bring the criminals to justice. "I want to be completely transparent about the financial impact," Barbara said, displaying detailed charts showing the fraudulent charges and their effect on the HOA's budget. While the stolen money represents a significant loss, our insurance policies and the potential for asset recovery from the arrested individuals mean that residents should not expect increases in their monthly dues. Mrs. Patricia Hamilton, who had attended the contentious board meeting several days earlier, raised her hand. "Barbara, how can we prevent something like this from happening again?" Barbara had anticipated this question and had developed a comprehensive reform plan. "We're implementing several new safeguards, including mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000, quarterly financial audits, and a resident oversight committee to review all vendor relationships." David Rodriguez stood up to address the assembly. "I want everyone to know that Barbara's investigation probably saved our community from losing hundreds of thousands of additional dollars." The criminals had plans to expand their fraud significantly before she exposed them. Margaret Wells nodded in agreement. Barbara received threatening letters and faced intimidation throughout this investigation, but she never wavered in her commitment to protecting our community's interests. Her courage and determination have made Heritage Oak safer and more secure for all of us. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, with residents rising to their feet to show their appreciation for Barbara's leadership. She had not only recovered stolen funds and exposed criminal activity, but it also demonstrated the power of principled leadership and community vigilance. Mr. Robert Kim from Oak Ridge Circle raised his hand during the question period. "Barbara, will you continue serving as our HOA president? I think I speak for everyone when I say that we need your leadership moving forward." Barbara looked out at the faces of her neighbors, seeing trust, gratitude, and hope reflected in their expressions. "I'm honored by your confidence, and yes, I will continue serving as president for the remainder of my term. Together, we'll build an even stronger, more transparent community that serves as a model for HOAs throughout the region." Detective E. Martinez, who had been invited to address the community about the criminal investigation, provided additional details about the prosecutions. Mrs. Chun's evidence has been instrumental in building cases against the entire criminal network. Tom Stevens, Linda Morrison, and Richard Walsh are facing federal charges that could result in significant prison sentences. Additionally, Detective Martinez continued, the investigation has led to asset seizures and frozen bank accounts that should enable substantial recovery of stolen funds for all affected communities. Chun's courage in pursuing this case, despite threats, has protected not just Heritage Oak, but dozens of other neighborhoods throughout the region. As the meeting concluded, residents approached Barbara individually to express their gratitude and support. Many commented on how her leadership had transformed what could have been a devastating financial crisis into a demonstration of community strength and resilience. 3 weeks later, Barbara received notification that the district attorney's office had secured guilty pleas from all 3 conspirators. Tom Stevens and Linda Morrison each received sentences of 4 years in federal prison, along with orders to pay complete restitution to all affected HOA. Richard Walsh, as the mastermind of the operation, received a sentence of 8 years and forfeiture of all assets connected to the fraud scheme. The financial recovery exceeded expectations, with Heritage Oak receiving full restitution of the stolen $85,000 plus additional funds from asset seizures. Barbara used the recovered money to establish a community improvement fund that would finance playground upgrades, enhance security systems, and beautification projects that residents had been requesting for years. On a warm April evening, 6 weeks after the initial discovery of the fraud, Barbara stood in the Heritage Oak Community Center addressing the monthly board meeting. The room was filled with residents who now attended regularly, their engagement and vigilance having increased dramatically since the criminal investigation. Fellow residents, I'm pleased to report that our new transparency initiatives have been overwhelmingly successful, Barbara announced, reviewing the quarterly financial report. All vendor contracts are now posted on our community website. Financial audits are conducted every 3 months, and our resident oversight committee has approved new policies that will prevent future fraud. Margaret Wells, now serving as both treasurer and chair of the oversight committee, presented the latest financial analysis. Thanks to Barbara's leadership and our community's commitment to accountability, Heritage Oak is now recognized as a model HOA by the State Homeowners Association. We've been invited to present our anti-fraud policies at the annual conference. David Rodriguez had been elected to serve as vice president, bringing his construction expertise and commitment to transparency to the leadership team. Barbara, your investigation not only saved our community money but also brought us together as neighbors. Property values have actually increased since we implemented your reforms. As the meeting concluded, Barbara reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that first anonymous threatening letter arrived at her doorstep. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate her into silence had instead motivated her to uncover a massive criminal conspiracy and implement reforms that strengthened her entire community. The Heritage Oak neighborhood now stood as a testament to the power of principled leadership, community engagement, and the refusal to accept corruption or intimidation. Barbara's red blazer and red-rimmed glasses had become symbols of integrity and fearless advocacy that inspired residents throughout the region. Her transformation from an HOA president dealing with routine administrative matters to a crime-fighting community champion had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could achieve extraordinary results when they refused to compromise their principles. The investigation had revealed not only the scope of the criminal conspiracy, but also the strength of community bonds when residents worked together toward common goals. Barbara's leadership had catalyzed a transformation that extended far beyond financial recovery, creating a culture of transparency, accountability, and civic engagement that would protect Heritage Oak for decades to come. Local newspapers had featured Barbara's story prominently, with headlines celebrating her courage and the successful dismantling of the fraud network. Other HOA presidents from surrounding communities had contacted her seeking advice on implementing similar transparency measures and fraud prevention protocols. Her experience had become a blueprint for protecting homeowners associations from sophisticated criminal schemes. Walking home after the meeting, Barbara passed the newly installed memorial plaque near the community center entrance. The plaque, installed by grateful residents, read, in recognition of Barbara Chun, whose courage and determination protected our community and demonstrated that justice prevails when citizens refuse to remain silent in the face of corruption. Barbara Chun had begun this journey as an HOA president concerned about billing irregularities. She had ended it as a community hero who had exposed a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy, recovered stolen funds, and implemented reforms that would protect homeowners for generations to come. Her unwavering commitment to transparency and justice had transformed Heritage Oak into the most prosperous and most engaged community in the region. The ripple effects of Barbara's investigation continued to spread throughout the state as other communities discovered similar fraud schemes in their own age. Law enforcement agencies now used her case as a training example for financial crime investigators, demonstrating how citizen vigilance and careful documentation could uncover complex criminal operations that might otherwise remain hidden for years. 3 months after the criminal trials, Barbara received an invitation to address the state legislature's Committee on Homeowners Association Governance. Lawmakers were drafting new legislation requiring enhanced financial oversight based directly on her Heritage Oak reforms. Her experience had become the foundation for protecting thousands of homeowners across the state. The threats and intimidation that were meant to silence her had only strengthened her resolve to protect the 215 families who had placed their trust in her leadership. Barbara's legacy would be remembered not just as the president who caught the criminals, but as the leader who proved that ordinary citizens could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to back down from doing what was right. Barbara Chen'in's incredible journey from concerned HOA president to community hero shows us the power of courage and determination. What did you think of this amazing story of justice triumphing over corruption? Share your thoughts about Barbara's heroic leadership in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. The End. Barbara Chen'in, The Heritage Oak Guardian. The Heritage Oak Guardian, Part 4. The Regional Alliance. 6 months had passed since Barbara Chen'in's triumph over the criminal conspiracy that had threatened Heritage Oak's financial security. On this crisp October morning in 2025, she sat in her home office wearing her signature red blazer and adjusting her glasses as she reviewed an urgent email that would test her leadership skills in an entirely new way. The message came from Patricia Morrison, president of the Willowbrook Estates, located 15 miles north of Heritage Oak. Patricia's community of 340 homes was facing a crisis that threatened the safety and welfare of every resident, and she desperately needed Barbara's expertise and guidance. Dear Barbara, the email read, "I know we've never met, but your reputation for solving complex HOA problems has reached our community. Willowbrook Estates is facing an environmental disaster that our current board feels completely unprepared to handle. We've discovered toxic contamination in our main water supply, and the estimated cleanup cost exceeds $1.2 million. Our insurance company is claiming that contamination predates our coverage, and our legal counsel seems more interested in protecting themselves than helping our residents. Could we possibly meet to discuss how Heritage Oak's reform initiatives might help us navigate this crisis?" Barbara immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Water contamination posed an immediate health threat that demanded swift, decisive action. Unlike the financial fraud she had uncovered at Heritage Oak, this crisis involved potential harm to hundreds of families, including children and elderly residents who might be particularly vulnerable to toxic exposure. She forwarded the email to Margaret Wells and David Rodriguez, her trusted allies who had become integral to Heritage Oak's governance reform initiatives. Within 2 hours, the three of them were sitting around Barbara's dining room table, reviewing environmental reports and legal documents that Patricia Morrison had shared. "Barbara, this is much more complex than the financial fraud we dealt with," Margaret observed. "Studying the technical analysis of water contamination levels, environmental law, insurance disputes, and potential health liability issues are far beyond our usual expertise." David nodded in agreement, but his expression reflected determination rather than discouragement. "That's true, but the fundamental principles remain the same. They need transparency, coordinated action, and leadership that puts residents' welfare first. Barbara, you've proven that ordinary citizens can tackle extraordinary challenges when they refuse to accept inadequate solutions." Barbara stood and walked to her window, looking out at the Heritage Oak community that had become stronger and more prosperous through principled leadership and resident engagement. "I think we need to approach this systematically. First, we assess the immediate health and safety situation. Second, we evaluate their legal and financial options. Third, we help them implement the kind of transparency and accountability measures that protected our community. That afternoon, Margaret and David drove to Willowbrook Estates for an emergency meeting with Patricia Morrison and her beleaguered board. The community was visibly distressed, with residents gathering in small groups, discussing bottled water deliveries, and expressing concerns about property values and family safety. Patricia Morrison greeted them at the Willowbrook Community Center. Her exhausted appearance, reflecting the stress of managing a crisis that threatened her entire neighborhood. "Barbara, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're willing to help us. Our residents are scared, our legal bills are mounting, and we feel completely overwhelmed." The Willowbrook board meeting that evening drew over 200 concerned residents, many carrying bottled water and wearing face masks despite being indoors. Barbara observed the proceedings carefully, noting the fear and confusion that permeated the discussion as board members struggled to provide clear answers about contamination sources and remediation timelines. When Patricia invited Barbara to address the assembly, she stood with characteristic confidence and immediately focused on the most critical issues. "Residents of Willowbrook Estates, I want to begin by acknowledging the severity of your situation and the courage you're showing by coming together to address this crisis. Your health and safety are the absolute priority, and every decision must be evaluated through that lens." She outlined a comprehensive action plan that drew from Heritage Oak's experience with crisis management and transparency initiatives. First, we need independent verification of all contamination testing. Second, we must establish clear communication protocols so every resident receives accurate, timely information. Third, we should explore every possible funding source, including federal environmental grants, state assistance programs, and potential legal remedies against parties responsible for the contamination. A resident in the back raised her hand urgently. "Barbara, our children have been drinking this water for months. How do we know they're safe?" Barbara's voice carried both empathy and determination as she responded. "That's exactly the right question, and it illustrates why we need immediate action on health monitoring. I'm recommending that Willowbrook establish a medical screening program for all residents, particularly children and elderly community members, with costs covered through emergency HOA funds and insurance claims." Margaret Wells stood to address the financial concerns that were clearly troubling many residents. "At Heritage Oak, we learned that transparency and professional expertise are essential during crisis management. We're recommending that Willowbrook immediately hire an environmental attorney who specializes in contamination cases and a public health consultant who can coordinate medical screening and safety protocols." David Rodriguez added his construction expertise to the discussion. "I've reviewed your preliminary environmental reports, and I believe the contamination source has been identified as a nearby industrial facility that operated from 1992 to 2008. This means there's clear potential for legal liability, which could significantly reduce the financial burden on your HOA. Over the following 2 weeks, Barbara worked closely with the Willowbrook Board to implement emergency protocols and coordinate professional services. She helped them establish a crisis communication system that provided daily updates to residents, coordinate with health officials to arrange medical screenings, and retain specialized legal counsel to pursue liability claims against the industrial facility responsible for the contamination. The transformation in community morale was remarkable. Fear and confusion were gradually replaced by organized action, confident leadership as residents saw their board implementing clear, professional responses to each aspect of the crisis. Barbara's guidance helped them establish the same kind of transparency and accountability measures that had strengthened Heritage Oak during its financial fraud investigation. 1 month into the remediation effort, Barbara received exciting news from Patricia Morrison. The environmental attorney had secured a preliminary settlement agreement with the industrial facilities insurance company for $2.8 million, more than double the estimated cleanup costs. Additionally, federal environmental grants would provide an additional $800,000 for community health, monitoring, and infrastructure improvements. The success at Willowbrook Estates attracted attention from HOA boards throughout the region, and Barbara soon found herself receiving requests for assistance from communities facing various crises. Oak Valley Gardens needed help with a construction defect lawsuit involving faulty roofing that affected 67 homes. Sunrise Meadows was struggling with a corrupt management company that had been overcharging for services and neglecting essential maintenance. Rather than attempting to handle each crisis individually, Barbara proposed an innovative solution that would maximize her impact while building long-term capacity for community problem solving. She would establish the Regional Homeowners Alliance, a cooperative organization that would provide crisis management expertise, transparency resources, and advocacy support to HOAs throughout the three-county area. The first meeting of the Regional Homeowners Alliance took place in December 2025 at the Heritage Oak Community Center, with representatives from 12 different HOAs in attendance. Barbara stood at the front of the room, her red blazer and red-rimmed glasses now recognized symbols of effective community leadership throughout the region. Fellow community leaders, we've gathered here today because we've learned that the challenges facing homeowners associations require more than individual responses, Barbara began, addressing the assembled representatives. Heritage Oak's experience with financial fraud, Willowbrook's environmental crisis, and the various problems other communities have encountered all demonstrate the need for coordinated action and shared expertise. Patricia Morrison from Willowbrook Estates spoke about how Barbara's intervention had transformed their community's response to the water contamination crisis. Without the Regional Alliance approach, our community would have spent years in legal battles, while our residents continued to face health risks. Barbara's guidance helped us achieve a resolution in 6 weeks that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The Alliance established working committees focused on different aspects of community governance, financial oversight and fraud prevention, environmental and safety issues, legal advocacy and dispute resolution, and transparency and accountability standards. Each committee would be co-chaired by experienced board members from communities that had successfully addressed similar challenges. Margaret Wells agreed to chair the Financial Oversight Committee, drawing from Heritage Oak's experience with audit procedures and fraud detection. David Rodriguez took leadership of the Environmental and Safety Committee, bringing his construction expertise and the lessons learned from Willowbrook's contamination crisis. Barbara would coordinate overall Alliance activities and serve as the primary advocate for transparency and accountability initiatives. Within 3 months of its founding, the Regional Homeowners Alliance had assisted 8 communities with various crises and prevented an estimated $4.6 million in losses through early intervention and professional guidance. The Alliance's success attracted attention from state legislators, who invited Barbara to testify about community-based approaches to HOA governance reform. Barbara's testimony before the state legislature's Housing Committee in March 2026 emphasized the power of regional cooperation and shared expertise. Honorable committee members, the challenges facing homeowners associations cannot be solved by individual communities working in isolation. The Regional Homeowners Alliance has demonstrated that cooperative approaches to crises management, fraud prevention, and advocacy can protect thousands of families while reducing costs and improving outcomes. The legislature's response exceeded Barbara's most optimistic expectations. They allocated $250,000 in annual funding for the Alliance's operations and authorized the creation of similar regional organizations throughout the state. Barbara's innovative approach to community problem-solving had become the foundation for protecting homeowners across the entire state. As spring arrived in Heritage Oak, Barbara reflected on the transformation that had occurred since her investigation of the Greenscape Solutions fraud. What had begun as a single community's fight against financial corruption had evolved into a statewide movement for HOA reform and transparency. Her commitment to protecting her neighbors had created a model for cooperative community leadership that was helping thousands of families. The Heritage Oak Community Center now served as headquarters for the Regional Homeowners Alliance, with staff members providing daily assistance to communities facing various challenges. Barbara's office displayed thank you letters from dozens of HOA boards whose residents had been protected through Alliance interventions and advocacy efforts. One particularly meaningful letter came from a family at Estates whose daughter had been diagnosed with a treatable condition related to water contamination exposure. The early medical screening program Barbara had recommended had enabled prompt treatment, and the settlement funds had covered all medical expenses. Mrs. Chun, the letter read, "Your intervention literally saved our daughter's health, and possibly her life. We can never thank you enough for your courage and leadership. However, Barbara's expanded role also brought new challenges and responsibilities. Managing a regional organization required skills and resources far beyond traditional HOA governance, and the increasing demand for alliance services was stretching their capacity. Barbara realized that the alliance's continued growth would require additional funding, professional staff, and expanded facilities. More significantly, Barbara had received an unexpected opportunity that would test her commitment to community service in an entirely new way. The governor's office had contacted her about serving as the state's first director of community housing advocacy, a newly created position that would oversee HOA reform initiatives and consumer protection programs throughout the state. The appointment would represent an incredible opportunity to expand her impact and protect homeowners on a scale she had never imagined possible. However, it would also require relocating to the state capital and transitioning away from direct leadership of the Regional Homeowners Alliance and her beloved Heritage Oak community. The position would involve overseeing a staff of 12 professionals, managing a budget of $3.5 million, and coordinating with federal housing agencies on policy development. On a warm evening in April 2026, Barbara stood in the Heritage Oak Community Center, addressing a packed assembly of Alliance representatives and Heritage Oak residents who had gathered to hear her announcement about the governor's offer. The room was filled with the same energy and engagement that had characterized her community since the successful fraud investigation that had started her journey as a regional leader. Friends and neighbors, over the past year, we've accomplished things that none of us thought possible when we began investigating financial irregularities in our landscaping contracts, Barbara said, her voice reflecting both pride and uncertainty about the decision she faced. The Regional Homeowners Alliance has protected thousands of families and demonstrated that ordinary citizens can create extraordinary change when they work together toward common goals. She outlined the governor's offer and the potential for statewide impact, but also acknowledged her deep connections to Heritage Oak and the personal relationships that had made her activism possible. This decision will affect not just my family and me, but the future of the Alliance and the communities we serve. I need your guidance and support as I consider whether to accept this appointment or continue focusing on our regional efforts. Margaret Wells stood up from her usual front row seat, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had supported Barbara through every challenge. Barbara, you've taught us that leadership means putting community welfare ahead of personal comfort. If the governor's office believes you can help protect families throughout the state, then we should support that opportunity. Even though we'll miss your daily presence in Heritage Oak, David Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Barbara, the principles you've implemented here can guide the Alliance, whether you're in the state capital or in Heritage Oak. You've built something that's bigger than any individual leader. The question is where you can do the most good for the most people. As the meeting concluded with overwhelming support for Barbara to accept the governor's appointment, she realized that her journey from Heritage Oak president to statewide advocate represented something larger than personal advancement. Her commitment to transparency, accountability, and community welfare had created opportunities she had never imagined possible. The decision would reshape not only her own future, but also the trajectory of community advocacy throughout the state. Barbara Chan's red blazer and red-rimmed glasses would soon become symbols of reform and protection for homeowners far beyond the Heritage Oak community that had first benefited from her courageous leadership. Will Barbara accept the governor's appointment and take her community advocacy to the state level? How will Heritage Oak and the Regional Alliance continue without her daily leadership? What new challenges await her in the state capital? Share your thoughts on Barbara's incredible journey, and don't miss the next chapter of this amazing story of leadership and community service. To be continued.